and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. So, as humans, we have to interact with clothing and we have to interact with food. If you're a listener of this podcast, then you must be interested in the sustainability of what you wear. So I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you also care about the sustainability of the food you eat. So what are the right choices when buying produce? The loose items or the organic versions that are wrapped in plastic? And what are the trade-offs we need to make to increase crop yields whilst also protecting biodiversity? Should we be worried about soil degradation and our ability to feed a growing global population? Is growing our own food helpful at all in the bigger picture? It's likely that you also have questions related to food production and the choices you make. In this episode, agricultural scientist and sewist Helen Metcalfe patiently answers all of my questions. So stick around a few minutes for that. But first, as always, I must know how you're doing, lovely listener. Have you had a good week? Thanks heaps to those of you who got in touch about last week's episode with Jenny Drew. A number of you told me that her motivational pep talk was exactly what you needed and that you were reprioritising sewing as a result. So what's on your sewing table at the moment? If you're an Instagram user, you might have seen that there's a fun new sustainability-related sewing challenge happening this month. If not, make sure you check out the challenge/hashtag #ScrapBustingSeptember, which has been created by previous guest Meg Grandstaff at the_grand_stash on Instagram. It's all about encouraging us to make some room by using up some of the scraps and leftovers that are most likely clogging up your sewing space. As you know, I regularly encourage others to see scraps and leftover fabric as a useful resource. So obviously I am in love with this challenge. To participate, you simply need to make something or some things using scrap fabric. That's it. It's going to be super fun and super useful, and I can't wait to see what everyone makes. By the way, I'm excited to say that Meg will be back on the podcast again in the near future, so keep your eyes and ears open for that. So in that vein, my sewing project that I started last week is utilising scraps and remnants. I'm making my son a sweatshirt as a present for his birthday next month. It's using some sections of extra thick sweatshirt fabric that I got from work. So these sections all have either like a weird join in them or writing on part of it, or both. But because I'm making children's wear, I've actually been able to cut out some quite usable sections around the weird bits. I've also got some plans this month to make some baby wear projects that will also be using more leftovers and remnants. So have you had any sustainability wins this week? So I've been meal planning hard, including using what's in my garden to eat, which effectively means kale, a little bit of chard and tomatoes. So I've been making loads of dishes that involve tomato sauce, such as homemade pizza and various pasta meals. So each time I've made one of those meals, I've used homegrown garlic and homegrown tomatoes, and I've made more sauce than was needed for that particular meal. And then I put the rest in the freezer. So now I have multiple portions of tomato sauce that can be the base for dinners going forward throughout the autumn. I've also been foraging blackberries, which I do at this time every year, predominantly from our local park, which is just down the road. My son helps me, which is super lovely. So those also get popped into our overstuffed freezer. I'm going to give it a couple more weeks to see if I can get a few more. Then we're going to make a whole load of jam to see us throughout the year. You know I love hearing about sustainability wins, so please do get in touch with yours. I'd particularly love to hear what you've been up to in terms of using up produce, perhaps some that you've grown yourself. Previous guest Naomi Fater has been growing and prepping up a storm lately, which I've been loving seeing, including making some chili jam, which I'm guessing tastes epic. Okay, this week, Big thanks to Kate for signing up to support the podcast via Patreon each month. If you feel you could help me cover the costs of making this podcast so that I can keep it weekly and I can keep it ad-free, please find the link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. You can sign up for any amount at all. About the cost of a cup of coffee each month is a pretty common amount, but anything at all that you are able to afford would make a difference and would be gratefully received. So on to today's episode. This one was devised super organically, and it started life from a somewhat controversial Instagram post I made about the Dirty Dozen. I hadn't been aware that I was posting something that would elicit such a variety of reactions, plus some well-meaning pushback, but Helen saw the post and the comments and kindly weighed in to provide some super knowledgeable and balanced responses. So I invited her onto the podcast to talk about the topic and answer plenty more of my food production related questions. So that's how this episode was born. Anyways, if you have any responses or further questions having listened to this, please get in touch with me by the usual means, emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. So until next week, please take care and enjoy. So you are, as well as being a crafter yourself, a sustainable agricultural scientist, and you have kindly agreed to come onto the podcast so I can quiz you and be schooled by you about sustainability as it pertains to the stuff that we eat. So let's start in the traditional way. If you wouldn't mind, can you tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Helen Metcalfe. I'm a research scientist from Rothamsted Research, which is an agricultural research institute based in Hertfordshire in the UK. And my work largely revolves around simulating agricultural practices. So I build and run computer simulations to understand how changes in agricultural management can have knock-on impacts on all sorts of things.
Wow. Okay, so what does your day look like then? What are you doing day to day? Are your days quite similar? Are you working on different projects at different times?
Yes, I have lots of different projects that are ongoing, looking at different aspects of agricultural systems. As I said, I do a lot of computer simulation. So I build computer-based models, so programming models, running statistical analyses, and analysing the results of those simulations. Also do a lot of work reviewing the literature, so reading what other scientists have written and trying to understand how that all fits together.
Amazing. How did you get into all that then?
I studied biology at university and I was really interested in that. But as I'm sure a lot of your listeners will sort of agree with, I had this really desire to understand more about sustainability and how that fitted in with everything I'd learned about biology and crop production.
Right. Did you have to then do kind of more specific studies for that, or you were able to get a position in a certain place to continue learning about that?
I did a master's degree in environmental science, so focusing on climate change and understanding the impacts of climate change on lots of different systems around the world. I then actually worked for 2 years as a research scientist looking at cereals in particular, so understanding the safety and quality of things like wheat and oats. And then after that, I decided to take on a PhD. So I studied for 4 years doing a PhD, and that was particularly looking at weed control in the UK. So how farmers can control weeds in a more sustainable way.
Awesome. Okay, I wasn't going to ask you this, but I feel I need to. So as somebody who's clearly really spent a lot of your time thinking about and learning about the impacts of climate change, how do you cope with eco-anxiety? Being surrounded with this knowledge, absorbing this knowledge, so much of your waking time, how do you stop from just wanting to go in the corner and have a big cry? Or do you?
Yes, it's really difficult sometimes, but I think the key to it is sort of realizing that you're only one person. You can do all the things that you can do. You can try and do your best, recycle everything, put into practice all these things like take plastic-free living, all that sort of stuff. But in reality, like through my work, I'm trying to influence policy and trying to influence the way that larger management practices are done across the UK in particular, but also worldwide. And it's through sort of that action at a larger scale that I feel Like you can take a little bit of the guilt away from yourself in terms of the individual actions that you're doing. And we can't all do everything all the time.
Yeah. Have you been involved in a project that you feel has, or has had an impact on policy, has made some change in that regard?
Yeah, so we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment on trying to understand how we can work together with the landscape to improve farming practices. And we actually submitted some evidence to the House of Lords in the UK about land use in England and how trying to combine agricultural land use with support for biodiversity can actually be more beneficial than, for example, having intense agriculture in one area and rewilding in a separate area.
Oh, interesting.
Well, we believe it's more effective based on the evidence that we've collected to try and integrate biodiversity into agricultural systems.
That's fascinating. And I think, but hopefully through some of the stuff we were going to be talking to today, we'll get a bit more into that. So the reason that we're having this conversation is because I made a post on Instagram that I thought was going to be quite a mild and uncontroversial post. It was about the dirty dozen foodstuffs that look like they could be a good place to start in terms of growing some of your own food, because those items are the ones that apparently contain the most pesticides when commercially grown. So as I say, I thought that it was just going to be kind of just a really standard post, but it actually attracted quite a lot of comments, including quite a few that were pointing out that they felt that the whole idea was kind of flawed or pointless. So I would really love it if you could maybe just describe in your more professional language what the dirty dozen are, and then maybe I could do a little recap of some of the comments and get you to respond, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. So the dirty dozen, it's a concept that was developed by an environmental group in the United States, and they identified 12 fruit and vegetable products that have the most levels of pesticide residue on them. Those pesticide residues are what remains on the vegetables after they've been harvested, processed, and sent to the shops.
Right. Okay. So it's not necessarily how much is used in the growth; it's just what's left on them.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, cool. Brilliant. So some of the comments were pointing out that levels of pesticides all vary greatly from country to country. So that may be not a concept that applies across the board. And there also, there was one response that suggested that the levels of pesticides are actually so low on the foods, you'd have to eat like thousands of pounds of kale, for example, to reach a dangerous level of pesticides in your system. So in your expert opinion, is the concept of the dirty dozen kind of just pretty meaningless? And are pesticides not actually something we need to worry about in terms of our bodily health?
I think it's worth starting by saying that pesticides are designed to kill organisms, and so they are inevitably going to be bad for humans. If you were to eat some pesticide, it would be really bad. Most countries around the world set regulations on how much pesticide is allowed to remain on food.
Okay.
These are called maximum residue limits. So the residue that remains of the pesticide on the food, there's a maximum limit that's allowed. And in that dirty dozen list, they sort of state that these are the 12 that have the most pesticides on, and they say you might find 2 or 3 different pesticides remaining on each of these foods. But actually, the US Food Standards Authority said that actually only 2% of food that they test across the whole of the US ever sort of exceeds those maximum residue limits.
Okay.
So most of the items in that dirty dozen list, they may have the most amount of pesticides that's found, but not necessarily above any limits that have been set by regulation.
Okay, so is it a little bit scaremongery then to be sharing things about, the dirty dozen?
It kind of is. I mean, it's still saying that if you're going to eat something that could have high levels of pesticide on, it's likely to be one of these types of food, but it's very unlikely to have any sort of health implications from eating those.
Okay, that's very reassuring.
Yeah.
So my super simplistic understanding of agriculture and farming practices currently is that the high reliance on synthetic pesticides, fungicides and fertilizers and stuff, that we have reduced soil health, making it harder to grow crops in the quantity that we need.
Not to mention the effects on like biodiversity and the effects on people like working on or near farms that use chemicals. But as the global population grows, we need to be producing more food. So it seems that our current non-organic farming systems are kind of failing. But however, organic and regenerative farming systems that centre soil health more, they kind of need more space, don't they, to grow food in the same volume. So it seems that maybe that's not the answer. So like, help. Can you like unpack it a bit and explain to somebody who's not versed in this, like what's going on?
Yeah, there really is quite a lot going on there. If we start with the idea that we think these intensive farming systems are not producing enough food for us because of things like soil health, like you said. It helps actually if we look back to the 1950s, 1960s, when we were going through what we call a green revolution. In this green revolution, it was when farming really sort of took pace and started to adopt the use of fertilizers and pesticides, irrigation, new crop varieties that were stronger.
Was that because of like the kind of the post-war baby boom?
Exactly. And so there was this like real sort of agricultural push and lots of new technologies. And we saw massive increases in crop yields worldwide. So there were sort of 50% increases in the amount of food that we could produce worldwide. Since the end of the 70s, 80s, those crop yields have plateaued. So they haven't declined due to this sort of intensive agriculture, but we're not seeing the sorts of increases that we would maybe expect to see. We're still developing new technologies and things, but we can't improve necessarily on what we saw in the green. So it seems as though we've sort of hit this barrier where we can't necessarily increase yields anymore.
So it's not actually going down. That's not true. It's not going down.
It's not particularly going down. There was quite a lot of debate a few years ago. There was an article published that said we only have 60 harvests left. Which was a very scaremongering article to do with the fact it was around the issue of soil health, saying that we've depleted our soils so much that we can't be growing crops on them for so long anymore. But in fact, some researchers argued against that. There's an experiment that has been growing wheat continuously for 180 years.
Wow.
So this is much more intensive than anything we would typically see in the real world, where farmers grow crops in rotations and things, which helps improve soil health and gets rid of pests and diseases. And in this experiment, for the first sort of 50, 60, 70 years, they did see declines in crop yield. And they also saw declines in soil carbon, which is a metric that we can say is related to the soil health.
Right.
But after a certain amount of time, both of these things stabilized. So there's clearly something going on in the soil that prevents it from degrading to such a point that we can't produce food anymore, or that the soil can't support crops.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah. And I think we don't necessarily understand what that is yet, but I think it sort of helps to refute the idea that we won't be able to grow crops anymore if we keep farming the way we are. I think it's a warning sign that we ought to do something differently, but yes, certainly not going to be the end of food production.
Okay, so we don't necessarily need to turn all agricultural farming over to organic.
No, and I think you were right in what you said before, in that organic agriculture does need quite a lot more land to produce the same amount of food. This goes back to that idea from the Green Revolution. If we apply fertilizers and pesticides, we can improve our crop yields quite dramatically. So when we take those away in organic systems, there is a reduction in the amount of food that we produce. And so you need to cover more land with food production.
Yeah, but presumably there is a big impact or benefit for biodiversity when we do use organic methods.
Yeah, certainly. So organic methods, you can only use organic rather than synthetic pesticides. So you are still allowed to use some pesticides, but they can't be produced synthetically. Some of these pesticides that you can use in organic systems are actually quite damaging to the environment.
Oh, really?
They use them in very small quantities. But actually, in recent years, we're turning a lot more to some of the practices that organic farmers adopt to try and incorporate those into more conventional farming systems. So I talked about crop rotations.
Yeah.
So rotating the crops around sort of helps to reduce pests and diseases within the fields. So if there's a particular disease that is very problematic in wheat crops, and then the following year you plant beans, for example, those pests are going to move away elsewhere because they can't find the wheat crops that they like to feed on. And so then when you next plant wheat crops, there's fewer pests in the field. So implementing practices like crop rotation, where it's very common in all types of agriculture, but particularly diverse rotations are found in organic farming. And they also implement a lot of what we call cultural control practices.
Oh,
so these are management practices. They're not necessarily chemical in nature. They're more developed through an understanding of the system. So we can try and understand how the plants will grow and how the diseases will spread, and do things in terms of crop management that sort of help to prevent those problems from happening.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so having a different understanding or a deeper understanding of the crops themselves.
Yeah. So things such as the type of cultivation that happens. So you might know when you walk through fields, often there's a time of the year when the soil is completely churned up and turned over. That's usually a result of ploughing, but that's not necessary in agriculture to plough. It was traditionally done every year. Most farmers now are doing it every 3 or 4 years or not at all.
Right.
This has some benefits and some negative consequences, but this is kind of a cultural control practice in that if you turn the soil over, you might bury some of the weed seeds that have dropped in the previous year so that they can't grow again. You're also changing the structure of the soil. And so you incorporate any remains of the plants get buried in. This puts some more organic material into the soil, which might make it more fertile. But by altering that structure, that can have negative impacts on soil health as well. So the structure of soil is really important for how it functions. By destroying that, we can have unintended consequences of doing these things.
Yeah, this is like the no-dig theory, but on a massive scale.
Exactly. So there's been a big movement in recent years for no-till or minimum tillage. And tillage is the practice of turning the soil over. And this is exactly the same principle as this no-dig gardening. So many farmers are turning to minimum tillage in order to sort of protect the soil structure.
Interesting. Okay, that's really cool. So can you tell us a bit more than what you were talking about the evidence that you were providing to the House of Lords about improving biodiversity within agricultural rather than as a separate endeavour?
So one of the things that I find particularly interesting that a lot of my work focuses on is this idea that farming is not necessarily a direct split between intensive farming and organic farming. It's actually a continuum, and we call this ecological intensification. We think that the farms that sit in the middle of this spectrum between intensive farming and organic farming may actually be able to produce as much food, if not more, than the intensive farmers, and may be able to support as much biodiversity as the organic farmers.
Okay, how do we get there?
So what this means is that we want to intensify our farming using ecology or biodiversity. To do this, we need to invest in what we call natural capital. If you think of capital in terms of economics, it's when you invest in a large project or a large piece of equipment that can then help you support your business. Natural capital is when we invest in biodiversity or in the soil or in the water. And these things can then help support the crop production. So if we invest in our soil, we improve the fertility of the soil, we improve the biological communities within the soil that can help control pests and things like that. It's not a direct investment in our crop production, but by improving that natural capital, it will then help produce our crops. The same goes for biodiversity. If we can put lots of measures in place that support biodiversity on farms, we increase the number of earthworms, the number of insects, things like that. Insects can play a really important role in crop production. So if we provide habitats and food resources for bees. They can help to pollinate our crops. There's certain beetles that can help eat weed seeds and crop pests. You might be familiar with the example of ladybirds eat aphids on your plants. And aphids are a really big problem for cereal production. So if we can support ladybirds within the agricultural landscapes, then they can sort of do the role that pesticides would be doing otherwise. And so a lot of my work recently has been thinking about how the natural landscape can help support agriculture in this way. And are there sort of particular locations on a farm that could provide us with the best opportunity to enhance these biological mechanisms that help produce more food with fewer inputs. So we look at things like how crop yields can decline at field edges, but how if we put certain features in, such as a grass strip, for example, down the edge of a field, which might support beetles, they like to live in tussocky grasses, then that could help improve the crop at the field edge because those beetles will be feeding on crop pests. So there's lots of interesting ways that we can work together with nature to help produce more food for us, rather than saying these are two separate endeavours that we want to do. We want to have intensive food production and we also want to rewild parts of the countryside. If we bring them together, then perhaps we can get the best of both worlds.
That's so good. That's so interesting. So to go back to the other point, as the world's population is increasing, are we going to run out of food? Are we going to run out of space for growing food?
Yeah, so we do need to increase food production quite dramatically. The world population, I think, is now set to reach 9 billion by 2050. There's lots of different things at play here. We need to increase food production generally. This can have ecological consequences in terms of needing to increase the amount of area that we grow food on. But it's not just the amount of food. We might have heard of the term food security, and this is having enough healthy food for everyone. So we need to have the right balance of nutrients within that food. And so it's not just thinking about increasing food production, it's about which crops we want to grow, what food sources we want to eat, and where we can put those.
So within that, where are we at with the balance of eating animals and eating plants? Because obviously there's spaces required for grazing or for keeping animals or growing food stuff for the animals compared to, growing stuff for us to eat directly. Like, where's that balance at now? Where should it be?
Yeah, again, this is another one where there's no simple answer, I'm afraid. With all of these things, there's going to be trade-offs. If you want to make one particular decision, it's going to have implications elsewhere within the food system. So there was a statistic that gets thrown around quite a lot that says you need 10 tons of cereals to create 1 ton of beef.
Right.
So you essentially need a lot more land to grow the cereals on to then feed to produce enough food for cattle to eat. There's some ways that you can get around this. So like pasture-fed animals can be a lot more sustainable than eating intensively produced animals. One of the benefits of pasture feeding is that we can use areas of land that couldn't otherwise grow crops. So
right, yeah.
I'm thinking, for example, of producing lamb in the Welsh uplands. High up on the hills, you can't necessarily grow a field of wheat, but you can put sheep out to pasture and produce food from them. I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of research on this recently for many reasons. But one of the key things that stand out is that humans can survive off only plant protein. There's clearly enough of all the different types of protein that we need within plant protein. This might not be true for some like elderly people and people with particular health conditions, but we can survive. As an entire human population, we cannot currently survive from plant protein alone. There's not enough of a particular protein, a particular amino acid, which is a component of protein called lysine. Getting a bit complicated here, sorry. Bear with me.
No, loving it.
So lysine is an amino acid that currently we get most of our resources from animal protein. The only plant-based source of lysine is in soybean that grows in a particular climate. So it's in very few countries that we produce this. If we wanted to produce enough lysine to feed the entire human population on plant protein alone, then we would need to dramatically change world agricultural systems, the infrastructure associated with it. And what this would primarily mean is a lot of deforestation in tropical regions.
Right.
So currently, it's a very nice choice to decide to avoid animal proteins because it is much more environmentally friendly to not eat meat for the sort of reasons associated with land use, but also associated with methane production. But I don't think it's currently feasible, certainly not in the near-term future, for us to try and shift global eating towards plant-based protein. And so again, this is one of those personal choices that is kind of about making what's the right decision for you, where you are in the planet, not just about like your opinions, but like, for example, in the UK, we produce a lot of meat in the UK. And so we might decide to avoid getting our lysine from those soy products and allow those to be used where they're grown locally.
Sure, because it'd have to be shipped across the world.
Exactly. Alternatively, we might say, well, as a nation with plenty expendable money, then we can choose to buy these expensive proteins that may not be affordable for people in the local regions, and then have the sort of cheaper meat production available to people who couldn't necessarily get their protein from other sources.
Oh, it's so complicated.
Exactly. And I think a lot of these things that we've been discussing in terms of your food choices as an individual, there's so many things to weigh up. It's about considering what's important to you individually.
Yeah.
Is it the distance the food has traveled? Is it the way it was produced? Is it the animal welfare? There's lots of different things we can consider. And each one of those decisions will have impacts on all sorts of other things to do with the environment, to do with biodiversity, chemicals in foods. And so it's about making those personal choices and, deciding which of those factors you feel are right for you to make a decision on.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that a lot before I can fully absorb that. Okay, thank you. Let's add another element to this, which is an element that I feel happier talking about. So, homegrown food. Mm-hmm. What are the benefits of eating homegrown food, eating food that we've grown ourselves, as opposed to shop-bought fruit and veg, whether that's organic or non-organic? Like, what is the benefit of that, if there is any?
I think as far as I feel about it, the main benefit that I can see of producing your own food is actually a social one. Understanding where your food comes from, understanding the work that goes into growing food, how the weather, the soils, everything like that affects how that food comes out. I think even if you just grow one type of food at home, it gives you a much better understanding of everything else that you're eating and sort of understanding the community that goes into it, all the farmers' work and the association with the environment, things like that.
Yeah. Also, I think that when it comes to food waste, you're less likely to want to waste something that you've grown yourself.
Definitely.
Yeah, like when I've grown something, like when I used to have an allotment and, you go away for a week, you can come back and you've got like these massive courgettes. You're like, I can't possibly eat them. Or you're like desperately trying to give them to people or put them on free cycle. And then it's like, if that was like something you'd had in your fridge, you probably wouldn't go those extra miles, would you, to try and make sure it's going into somebody's hands that will eat it.
And I think having that connection with your food, it makes you more aware of all of these things, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then definitely the weather as well. Like you have a really good year, like I'm the best at growing tomatoes. And then the next year, like you have a wet spring or something, you're like not as good. You're like, oh, I don't feel so smug now.
Exactly. And I think things like that, it's worth sort of trying to bear that in mind when we go to the supermarket and there's no salad on the shelves.
Yes, because recently, wasn't there was no tomatoes for ages, wasn't there?
Exactly. And we sort of, I think a lot of people dissociate that from, that was real humans' income. It was their business that the weather caused that this crop wouldn't grow. And if that'd been you at home, you might have been devastated that your tomatoes weren't growing as well as usual or whatever. But when it happens at a larger scale on farms, we sort of step away from it and just get annoyed that we can't buy our food.
Yeah. We're so used to being able to get whatever we want any time of the year,
Exactly.
really, aren't we?
And I think if we do want to reduce reliance on technologies and on pesticides, then we have to sort of be more accepting of the fact that sometimes crops do fail and sometimes we can't have everything we want all year round.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you feel about like seasonal fruit and veg? Like, do you think it's important that whether you're growing it yourself or whether you're buying it in the shop, should we be paying more attention to what's in season and what's not and helping that guide our choices?
Yes, I personally try and eat fruit and vegetables within season, mostly because then I know that they've travelled less distance. They're sort of, They've grown locally. Although it's not always as simple as that, because sometimes it actually works out better from an emissions perspective if we were to, say, for example, freeze apples from the UK to have out of season than it would be to transport them across the world, things like that. So again, everything has consequences, and just trying to decide.
It's complicated. Like, I mean, I think, and then obviously finances is a massive thing because often organic versions of stuff is at least 3 times the price of non-organic and stuff like that.
And I think that's why it's really important to sort of understand that there's nothing particularly special about the organic label, other than they've implemented all of those practices, but there may be many fruit and vegetables on the shelves that were grown in very similar ways that haven't got that certification. Again, there may be vegetables that were grown very, very differently, and there's no sort of distinction between those. But in terms of choosing which bag of apples to buy, then it's up to you to sort of make those decisions on what's important to you. And I think what's really important in terms of food security is that we don't automatically dismiss the ones that were farmed conventionally, because for some people that's their only option. And I think by demonizing things like pesticides and stuff, it sort of puts a lot of pressure on people that are really struggling to buy food. And so sometimes when we're privileged enough to be able to spend a bit more on other things, and that's a good choice to make.
Yeah. And what about food that you can buy loose or packaged?
Yeah.
Like often I like with not knowing what to guide my decisions, often that's the guide that I go for. Like I tend to buy apples loose, even though they're a bit more expensive than 6 in a plastic thing, just because then it's not the plastic. I understand that plastic is important in a lot of products because it gives them longevity, but sometimes with like apples, it's almost the same.
Exactly. I'm the same. I tend to buy the loose products because I don't want to have the plastic waste at home. I sometimes am a little bit skeptical as to whether they were transported already in all the plastic and we just don't see it so much.
Good point.
There may be some greenwashing going on there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because sometimes they come in those crates, don't they? And then that's got plastic around it, hasn't it?
Exactly. But I think it's probably still less plastic than having 6 apples in a bag together.
Sure.
Yeah, there's definitely some arguments where plastic is a better choice than, say, cardboard when transporting things long distance.
Okay, yeah.
It's going to survive the crossing. If it's going by a ship or something, it's not going to cause reductions in the quality of the food. But as far as like buying things in the supermarket, I try and avoid as much plastic as possible.
Yeah. So of course, like that is one real good benefit of growing your own, is that you don't have the plastic waste issue. Obviously, like the ability to grow some of your own food is a big privilege in and of itself, like whether that's at home or in a community space or an allotment or something. but I read a statistic that was saying that the total meterage of all UK gardens is greater than all our national parks combined. If we could convince, I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing, I think, but if you could convince loads of people to have a go at growing some items themselves, does that represent a bit of a game changer? Or am I just being super naive?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it would be a really important change, because it would be a lot of land area. If it was to work in a sort of cooperative kind of way, that would be huge, because obviously there's sort of economies of scale when you're growing things. If you filled your whole garden with tomatoes, that would be more productive than if everyone grew one tomato plant and one bean plant.
Okay, of course. Yes. Okay, I'll do the tomatoes, you do the onions, you do the broccoli.
Exactly. And again, we'd have this sort of split between people living in cities and people living in the countrysides and things like that. So the balance of food that way. But yeah, there's definitely ways it could work. And there's been a movement quite recently for a lot of research investigating growing things vertically. So in skyscrapers in cities, converting them into farms or on rooftops, so that everyone can sort of be involved in these community farms and community gardens to grow their own food, which I think is a really interesting idea. There's certainly some things that you wouldn't necessarily have the infrastructure at home to buy. So all the cereals, for example, I don't think everyone's going to put a mill up in their garden. I think for fruits and vegetables, it can work really well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think if you're going to grow your own fruit and vegetables, it's really important to choose something you like.
Good point. Yeah.
Something you're going to enjoy growing, you're going to enjoy eating. Maybe try something new that you like to eat but you haven't grown before, to understand a bit more about the food that grows where you are. And I think sort of setting yourself up for success is really important. So choosing something that grows well in the climate and with the soils that you have nearby can be really important. I think you're much more likely to keep doing it if you're successful. So particularly for the UK, the RHS website has a lot of really useful information. If you can find out what soil type you have, that can make a really big difference.
Do you mean by that, do you mean as in clay or sandy, or do you mean as in the pH?
Mostly if it's clay, sand or silt, that's going to have the biggest impact. So if you go out in the garden and it looks like you've got big clumps of soil, there's a bit sticky tacky, that means you have a clay soil, it's very heavy. If you have a lighter, sandier soil, that will grow very different crops in it. You can imagine a root crop, like a carrot trying to grow down through a clay soil. It's going to have much more difficulty than if it's growing down through a sandy soil. That's where you're going to get those funny shaped carrots if you're growing it in clay. It's trying to grow around the big lumps. So I think understanding a little bit about your soil can really help you pick what you're going to grow.
Awesome. I remember what point I was going to make. I heard somewhere that there'd been a study of biodiversity on allotments, and they said that there was a greater biodiversity on an allotment site than the equivalent hectare or whatever of a national park. Which I thought was super interesting. So that's another reason that maybe growing your own stuff rather than having a lawn or obviously crazy paving or something isn't great.
Sure. And the same thing applies as on farms. If you do things to encourage biodiversity in your garden, then it can help you grow your crops.
I love that. I love that interesting, that idea of what people are doing in their gardens can be translated on a bigger scale, and similarly what's working on the bigger scale we can do on a smaller scale as well.
Exactly. And I think that's really important, that we don't ever sort of think that there's one group of people that knows how to do it better. And I think everyone learning from each other, we're sort of all muddling through trying to figure out the best way to do things, particularly as the climate's changing. Nobody knows how to do things best in that situation.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. So let's talk about being a maker.
Yeah.
So you are yourself a maker as well. So what are your preferred crafty mediums?
Yeah. So I love to sew and knitting as well. I can't do as much knitting anymore. I suffer with some chronic illnesses that make knitting quite difficult for me, but I do like to get some sewing in every weekend.
Lovely. So when did you start sewing?
I started sewing whilst I was doing my PhD, actually, as a sort of creative outlet.
Oh, so was it something you just kind of felt yourself naturally gravitating towards, or were you like quite conscious, I need something to offset all this study?
No, I think I was in a petrol station and I saw the Tilly and the Buttons, her first book, Love at First Stitch, and I just thought, oh, that looks fun. Picked it up.
In a petrol station?
Yeah.
That's a very cool petrol station.
I think it was like a service station where they have a Smiths and all the pile of books.
Oh, nice. So you just thought, oh, yeah, cool.
So then I got my mum's old sewing machine and just taught myself from that book. Yeah.
So what kind of role does sewing play in your life at the moment?
It's still quite a creative outlet. A lot of my work is very sort of centred on the computer, a lot of numbers, facts and figures. So it's nice to sort of have a nice creative thing to do. I still enjoy that it's quite structured when you're following a pattern and have to calculate little bits and pieces. But yeah, it's sort of a chance to do something quite different to what I do day to day.
Yeah, lovely. Are there any other kind of like links between your kind of interest in sewing and making and in agriculture and food, like the way that you do your thoughts or experiences of one inform the other in any way?
My experience of understanding trade-offs in agriculture has really sort of helped me make choices in terms of which fabrics I buy. Oh. Because obviously things like cotton is still a crop that's grown agriculturally. And I think when I first started out, I was really over-analytical, thinking, well, I can't buy polyester because that has microplastics that get released into the ocean. And I can't buy cotton because there's excessive water use in cotton crops. And I was really trying to like weigh up all these differences. And
bless you, like what's left?
Exactly. And the more I understand how every decision in agriculture has trade-offs and unintended consequences, I realised actually choosing the fabric that I will enjoy making with, that I'll enjoy wearing and I'll want to wear and repair for a long time to come is actually much more important than buying that Eco-Vera Tencel or whatever it is, because there's going to be some problem with every fabric. And so I do that. I buy the fabrics that I want to wear and make with. I do try and reduce the waste where possible. So I really love zero waste garments.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. I really love the zero waste gather dress. That's my favourite one to make. I've made 3 versions of that so far. Yeah, and just trying to use up scraps as sort of pocket linings and things like that where possible.
Brilliant. So where can people go, would you say, if they want to learn more and on a deeper level about kind of sustainable agriculture and food choices?
Yeah, so there's lots of different organisations out there. The institute that I work for is called Rothamsted Research. There's loads of information on their website. And there's also lots of things on some of the global organisations like the FAO. So that's the Food and Agriculture Organisation that's part of the United Nations. So they have lots of really cool stuff at an international level. And then I do post some things occasionally on my Instagram, which is a mixture of like crafty stuff and food and farming and everything in between.
So what's your handle?
I'm at Helen Lives Slow.
Nice. Brilliant. Okay, I'll put all those in the show notes. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and I have a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!